Good morning. Welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. My name is Megan Shore. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a program coordinator with the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Before we get started today with the webinar, Tricia and I are going to go over a few logistics of the Zoom platform and the format that we're going to be using.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. Welcome, everyone. So this is actually our first time doing a webinar via Zoom. I know some of you folks might have done a webinar via Telscan, so we're testing this out with Zoom. So just a couple of logistics for folks today. The chat function, feel free to put questions throughout the time, and Megan and I will be checking it, and Darren will be able to answer some questions at the end. If there's some tech issues that are coming up, feel free to message us privately or in the larger group in the chat box. And then as you log in, the video function was automatically off and everyone is muted. And so since we are kind of doing more of a webinar format, feel free to turn off your video if you have it on, and keep your audio muted on your end, just because we're also recording the webinar. We do have closed captioning, so you can turn that on. It is toward the bottom of the screen. I think it should say closed caption. You can turn on subtitles there. Let us know if you have questions about that. And the recording will be available after. It will be on our website. And you'll also receive a survey from Megan following the webinar and the PowerPoint. And all of that information I just said is in the chat box, so I'll repaste it on there. One more thing. On the sidebar next to the chat, if you have your chat open, there are these two lines next to the pictures of our faces and then the slideshow. You can make the slideshow bigger by dragging that line outwards to the right so you can see the PowerPoint. And I think that is it. If I'm missing anything, let me know, Megan.
Awesome. No, great. Thanks, Tricia. The Coalition is wicked excited to have Darren Dorsey leading us today in a webinar titled Rooting Our Movement, Resisting Institutional Influence in Our Efforts to End Gender-Based Violence. Darren has been in the anti-violence movement since 2009 and has been engaging communities and coalitions in critical conversations and efforts around prevention and response of sexual and domestic violence since that time. The roots of the sexual and domestic violence movement are those of activism. They are by and for communities, and they sought to address systems of oppression that create and fuel violence in many forms. Over the years, our movement has shifted. There has been growth and change that has both strived to address systemic oppression as the root cause of violence, and growth and change that has also been counter to this work. As we will hear from Darren today, our movement's connection to institutions and systems that support and create further oppression and inequity have implications on the work we strive to engage in. We are honored to learn from him today and excited to engage in conversations around how we ensure our prevention and advocacy services resist institutional impacts of oppression while continuing to make transformative and collective change. Thanks so much for joining us today, Darren.
Awesome. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Megan. And thank you everyone for joining us. I really appreciate just people taking their time out to hear about this and hear from me. I'm excited to get started. So again, like Megan said, this presentation is called Rooting Our Movement, Resisting Institutional Influence in Our Efforts to End Gender-Based Violence. And one thing that I want to acknowledge at the outset, and then I'll probably acknowledge throughout, is that we only have a little less than 90 minutes here. And so there's a lot more work to be done, and I'll be talking about that as we go through this. So I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Megan, can you let me know if you can see that and everything looks good?
Yeah, I can see your introduction slide right now. It looks good.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that. Also, by the way, I use he, him, his pronouns. I apologize for not mentioning that at the outset. Um, so I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about our agenda today. So I'm going to start with some acknowledgements that you'll see, and I'll briefly go through that slide. And then I will go through a kind of brief and incomplete history of the movement. I'm being very upfront that it is incomplete. The idea is just to kind of ground us in that history as we talk about institutional influence. And then we'll talk a little bit about how that institutional influence plays out, what the impacts of that are, and some potential solutions and reimaginations. Um, for this presentation, I'm leaning on a few different texts, articles, and accounts of people who have been in the movement and who've been talking about this for a really, really long time. So that's something, again, that I'll bring up probably a few times, is that this isn't exactly new information that I'm presenting. And the goal is really to present this information as a foundation for people to continue to explore this topic. And so more learning will be necessary to actually engage in the resistance towards the resistance of institutionalization of the movement. And hopefully this can be the start of that for some folks. Another piece that I think is really important is that part of what I want to do with this webinar is highlight the voices of those who have really called out the impact of institutionalizations going back a very long time, and also validate the experiences of people who have had these experiences, who have noticed, you know, maybe something's not right here, and to really validate that some of those feelings are very real. So I'll go ahead and start with these acknowledgements. And part of the reason why I do this, again, is to reiterate that this is not new knowledge. So on the top line here, I have lots of folks in this movement that I've worked with, I've had the privilege of knowing and that I've learned from, who have contributed to my analysis of violence and how to prevent it. There's also some books that I've read that have also contributed to that analysis. And it going in that direction, if you look at many of the sources that I lean on for this content, you'll find acknowledgements there where some of the folks that wrote and presented this content also had people that they were influenced by. And excuse me, one group in particular that I'll highlight because they show up a few times is Insight, Women, Gender, Nonconforming, and Trans People Against Violence. They have a couple of books, they have a website, and they've been doing a lot of fantastic work over the decades, and as evidenced by this slide, have influenced a lot of people. So again, I'm going to start with a kind of a brief history to kind of set our foundation. And this is another place where I encourage people to continue to explore. And so I have a couple of links here that people can access, and the PDF of the slides should be shared so people can go to that, click these links, and learn more. The one that I'm going to lead on the most today is the History of the Rape Crisis Movement and Sexual Violence Prevention by Gillian Greenside. And in that, I have it quoted here where they state that the history of the rape crisis movement in the United States is also a history of the struggle of African-American women against racism and sexism. So I highlight this because when I came into this movement, I was told a lot about some of the work that happened in the 70s that led to the creation of rape crisis centers, but wasn't necessarily told about these roots of the movement. So I think that's really important to highlight. In the middle here is a book called Celia, a Slave. Celia was someone who was enslaved, who was in that enslavement experienced abuse and rape, and Celia resisted that and and defended herself, and she killed the slave owner. That case went to court, and Celia was found guilty of murder. But I highlight this because if you look at present day, you can find numbers of examples of people who experience sexual violence, experience gender-based violence, and they resist that. And then there are consequences for that. So there are a number of people that are in jail today for murder or assault because they defended themselves. And so this is one of the first cases that we have written down for this. Another incident that I have here is the Memphis riots that happened in 1866. So this is a drawing of a depiction of those riots. And during the Memphis riots, it was basically a 2-day massacre against Black communities in Memphis, Tennessee, where about 50 Black people were killed and dozens of women experienced rape and sexual abuse. Following this, 5 Black women survivors went to Congress and testified about their experience of sexual violence. Unfortunately and unsurprisingly, no one was found guilty of these crimes, but it does represent, I think, to my knowledge, the first time in US history that someone went to Congress or to a government body and talked about the sexual violence that they experienced and sought justice for that. And again, I encourage people to think about current times and the experiences that we have currently of people who have experienced sexual violence and are testifying in front of courts and in front of the legislature and the Congress, and where the roots of that kind of activism comes from. In addition to some of that history, the roots of America is based in colonization. And a big part of that colonization is the physical violence and gender-based violence that occurred. So these couple of quotes are from Martha Bono, who wrote a dissertation on this issue. There's actually not a lot of information around the resistance that I could find around the resistance to sexual violence and gender-based violence in Native American communities, because a lot of that history has been erased. And so if anyone has sources or things like that that can help bolster this presentation in the future, I would love to hear about that. But Martha Bono highlights the way that that a lot of Native American and Indigenous societies were reshaped through this violence, and how prior to this colonization, the gender roles in society and that balance were very different, and that part of the colonization brought a lot of these inequities. And again, I want to highlight the fact that resistance to that has happened from the outset, from the beginning of colonization in America. And unfortunately, we don't have as many names or incidents to relate back to, because unfortunately that history has been lost for a lot of us, or at least is very hard to find. So make sure that's okay. I skipped one there. So I want to talk a little bit, moving forward a little bit, to the roots of our organizations. So in the 1800s, there was the Women's Club movement, where a lot of women who were kept out of mainstream institutions of society formed their own clubs, where they did various things, including social services, consciousness raising, and just holding space for people. And as we got to the late 1800s, white women were brought into a lot of those mainstream institutions that were dominated by men, and so it became more of a Black women's club movement. And Ida B. Wells is here pictured because she was a huge part of that. We can see direct and indirect links between the Black Women's Club movement and rape crisis centers, the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the National Association of Colored Women, the NAACP, and lots of other organizations. And we can tie direct links to the Montgomery bus boycott, age of consent laws, and a lot of other social reforms. So I present this to just kind of make the case that this is the roots of our organizations and how they came to be. Again, this is a very, very incomplete history. There's a lot of things that happen between some of these incidents, a lot of things that we don't even know about or were not recorded in history. but hopefully this kind of sets the foundation. So, excuse me, in the 70s, we began to see some of the early rape crisis centers. I believe some of the early domestic violence shelters showed up in the late 60s and early 70s as well. And this is from Jillian Greensight's article on the history of the rape crisis movement. They talk about as more and more women began sharing their experiences of rape in consciousness raising groups, breaking the silence that had kept women from avenues of support, as well as from seeing the broader political nature of rape, a grassroots movement began to take shape. Jillian Greensight then goes on to state that the establishment of rape crisis centers by rape survivors brought large numbers of middle-class white women into political activism. Although women of color were still involved, their visibility and efforts were made largely invisible in the absence of critical attention to racism within the movement and by white women taking the center stage. Gradually, the rape crisis movement became to be seen as a white woman's movement. And so that's something that I think a lot of people have expressed. And I wanted to include that as a piece of this history. And that's evidenced by a lot of what was going on in this time. Unfortunately, a lot of that history, again, is hard to find. We are very fortunate that Miriam Kaba, who's a current activist in this movement, recently brought back some of this history and created a zine that is going to be included in the resources at the end of this presentation. And in this zine, they reflect on the open letter to the anti-rape movement from Santa Cruz Women Against Rape. And I highly, highly recommend that folks read that whole thing. I'm not trying to summarize any of these sources or these articles because it's really, really important that people engage with them in the way that they're meant to be engaged with. And so hopefully this can kind of serve as an introduction to that. But we see that in 1977, this group, Santa Cruz Women Against Rape, are writing this letter, this open letter, because they're concerned about the direction of the anti-rape movement. And they say their primary concern is the issue of the relationship to the criminal justice system. And this is a critique that's been ongoing throughout the movement. And Miriam Kaba reflects on that and says it's important to remember that the anti-rape movement of the early 1970s emerged out of a radical women's movement that was suspicious of relying too heavily on the state to address its concerns. Early grassroots rape crisis centers explicitly operated outside of the social service paradigm and focused on mutual aid. They did not mainly rely on law enforcement and the courts. Some worried that accepting money from the state would make the movement beholden to its interests. So this is occurring in 1977. And as we kind of move forward, we see an increased institutionalization and increased reliance or relation to the criminal justice system. One piece of institutional influence that is pretty big in our field, a pretty big force, is VAWA. And so before I get into this, I do want to mention that VAWA is an incredible achievement and has done a lot of great things. And it has also institutionalized our movement. And so this source is from The Braid That Binds Us, which I'll be leaning on quite a bit throughout the rest of this presentation. And again, I really, really encourage people to read that one. And they talk about that through VAWA, DV is treated as an individual level problem with money provided for shelters, law enforcement, and targeted intervention services. DV funding has been increasingly tied to the state through VAWA and other mechanisms, both impacting how DV is defined and understood, and shaping the type of initiatives that receive funding. Organizations seen as providing the most efficient intervention services receive the most public funding, resulting in small, grassroots-oriented programs being absorbed by the larger social service industrial complex. So we begin to see how this relation to the state and the way that the state is then defining these issues for us instead of with us or in response to us is leaving people out. And we'll talk more about some of those examples as well. So most of my experience is in prevention, although I've done advocacy, I've done policy and a number of other things. And so I want to talk a little bit about how this institutional influence takes place in prevention. One thing that we could look at for this is the language of the original VAWA bill. So it very explicitly states that the government should select, implement, and evaluate several model programs for 4 different audiences, and all 4 of those being in schools. And again, things are complicated here. There are a lot of benefits that happen as a result of this. Our work came into schools, which is incredibly, incredibly important. But it's also important to highlight the fact that prior to VAWA, our work was happening in communities. And there was a lot of community level prevention that was going on. The braid that binds us highlights this and states that there's been little expansion of funding of primary prevention of DV outside of the recent push towards men's engagement, which is also focused on the micro individual level. I will provide the caveat that a lot of this has changed, and there has been a recognition that we need to move towards the community level, that we need to pull a little bit of our resources outside of schools and influence the community more. But again, I'm highlighting this to highlight the fact that the work that was happening before VAWA was largely happening in communities. And as funding shifted towards schools, it shifted away from communities. And what we've seen recently is a shift back to communities. However, oftentimes that comes with various language or theories that can be hard to understand and often are co-opted from the originators of this movement and of these theories. So I have a photo here in the bottom of the Oakland Men's Project, which was established in 1979. And I have a book behind me called Men's Work by Paul Kibble. And if you identify as a man, I highly recommend reading this book. And if you read it, you'll find that a lot of the strategies that it talks about are incredibly community level. And there's a great analysis of how these types of violence and how sexism and masculinity fits within a larger understanding of societal oppression. And in many ways, as the field became institutionalized and as prevention became institutionalized, we lost this analysis. And this is further expanded on by the article, The Braid That Binds Us. And they state that the emphasis on evidence-based practice and testable interventions forecloses research and practice approaches that address larger structural conditions and or employ participatory anti-oppressive methods. So I just want us to think about, what would it have looked like if this original language in VAWA stated that the secretary will identify existing programs, learn from those, evaluate those, and develop best practice based on those programs. A lot of the work that had been done in the 70s and the 80s would have been expanded on and would have been bolstered. But instead, what largely happened was a lot of those folks lost their funding. And a lot of new programs were created. I know that for me, when I came into this field, everyone was talking about Safe Dates, a curriculum for teenagers around violence prevention. And Safe Dates does not have much of an analysis of how racism and oppression interacts with domestic sexual and gender-based violence. And so this is something that we're losing, because again, if I look back to this book called Men's Work that was created by Paul Kibble and influenced by the Oakland Men's Project, you see that analysis. And so that was lost as we institutionalized the field and moved into more evidence-based prevention. So Another piece that I want to talk about is who are our work targets or who are work resources. So on the left here, I have a quote from a Men Can Stop Rape staff member who made this post on Break the Cycle's blog that talks about fraternities' roles in sexual violence. And in it, he states that fraternities have an incredible amount of influence on college campuses and worldwide. Fraternities are student leaders, CEOs, presidents, entertainers, and that if we can influence these men at the top of society to incorporate prevention and healthy masculinity, that that will trickle down into society. And in many situations, in many ways, this person is not wrong. They're absolutely right, and that's evidenced by these statistics that are in the middle here. If you look at the largest corporations, they're headed by fraternity men. If you look at the highest points of government, they're headed by fraternity men. Fortune 500 executives, fraternities. And so again, this is not wrong. However, I think this analysis leaves something out where it's not questioning the fact that should these people be the leaders of our society. It's not questioning the fact on whether or not that the fact that on a college campus, the most influential, powerful, and well-funded organization are fraternities, and whether or not that has any relationship that people in fraternities often can commit sexual violence with impunity. That analysis is not here. And so what ended up happening is that as we did more and more research and evaluation, we found that those who had high rates of perpetration were fraternities. And so what studies and what research told us to do is, okay, we have to target that group. That's a high risk group, and that's absolutely true. But we also have to understand this in the context of society and larger systems of oppression, and think about, should we be going to fraternities with this assumption that they're the leaders of our society and we just need to influence the leaders? Or should we maybe be propping up other groups on campus to create a more equitable environment? And maybe that might address the violence that's happening in these institutions. So that's just something that I think is incredibly important to think about. And I have a picture here that's somewhat personal to me. I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and shortly after I got there, I learned about this Props House incident where a fraternity was using this house and they were having a party. They were playing beer pong and they had Confederate flags out in California. Two of them, they were having a party. And if you actually look closely in this picture, that's partly why I use this picture, is because when it's more explicit, it can be very triggering. But in the background, there's a noose back there. And this was a part of their partying. And we've seen similar incidents happen across the country. We've seen issues of rampant sexual violence, and also, for example, people at Yale chanting horribly homophobic, racist, and sexist things. And that's just for me to highlight that, this particular instance is more personal to me, but this is something that's happened throughout our society. And it's largely because if you look at fraternities, and I'm not saying that they can't be saved, that there's no good there, but if you actually look at their legacy, fraternities have utilized racism, sexism, and homophobia over decades and centuries of time in the United States to establish the situation where you can join a fraternity and be more likely to be the president of the United States. And so for us to go into that institution and expect for them to change our society and create a world without violence makes a lot less sense when you think about it in that way. Another piece that I want to talk about is, which I don't have a slide for necessarily, but is the way that we talk about bystander intervention. When people originally were talking about these issues, they were talking very much about interrupting a culture of sexual violence. How do you talk to that friend when they say something sexist or make a joke sexist. And through research and evaluation, it became a lot more simplified in a lot of contexts. Not every context. There are some folks that did bystander intervention and continue to do it extremely well, but there are also people who really just focused on acts of sexual violence. How do you step in when a sexual assault is happening right now? And that's not to say that those issues aren't important. However, that's not how you stop sexual assault on campus. We need to address the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that lead to that person committing that act as well. And we become a lot more focused on those acts because it's easy to evaluate. If we talk to someone about intervening and how to identify these situations and how to intervene, then at the end of that session, even if it's 45 minutes long, oftentimes they're gonna write in an evaluation that they're more likely to intervene in these situations. But that doesn't necessarily change that culture on campus. So that's another example. Another thing that I'd like to kind of talk about is the way that institutional influence takes place in advocacy. Folks might be familiar with the image on the left here. That's not exactly what our intake forms might look like, but it might be similar. In fact, I've also seen intake forms that are 3 or 4 pages that are much longer than this. So as our field has become more institutionalized, we've seen that many crisis and support hotlines, which originally just served as a place to hold space for survivors, have turned into intake mechanisms. And you call and you get referred to therapy, to an accompaniment, or to reporting. But sometimes there's not that space that's being held for people. And this, of course, varies depending on the agency. But I will give an example that I've worked for an agency that had a limitation of 15 minutes on the crisis line. You were instructed and trained if you hadn't referred the person or come to any sort of conclusion within 15 minutes to attempt to end that call in this organization that I worked with. And so we see there that the original intention of these crisis lines has been twisted to very much serve the hospitals in the way that they take in accompaniments, or law enforcement in the way that they take in reporting, or therapists. And so that's one example there. The Braid That Binds Us talks a lot about this and talks about how the increase of credentialing and academic requirements for DV agency staff has devalued people with lived experience and has narrowed who we deem as fit to do the work, which in many cases has led to organizations. I think there's a bit of a pushback from this at this point, but for a while, I know of organizations that wouldn't really hire survivors, or they required that there be some arbitrary period of 1 year or 2 years after the assault or violence that they experienced in order to be a staff. And again, I'm not saying that there should be no attention paid to whether or not someone's ready to be an advocate. But if we have agencies that don't have survivors, then that's probably going to look a lot different than agencies that are informed by survivors as staff. In addition to this, if you look at the policy realm of advocacy, you'll see that a lot of the priorities within advocacy or within policy advocacy are focused around the criminal justice system and the healthcare system. And again, things are complicated. A lot of these policy achievements have been absolutely wonderful and fantastic and great, but there has been a lack of attention to a lot of other issues. When people think about the folks that walk through the door of their agencies, think about whether or not that policy serves that person that walked through the door. There's been a lot of focus on things like extending the statute of limitations, which, that's something that we can debate whether or not that's a good direction to go in. But what's a fact is this diagram and graphic from Rain right here that I think a lot of us have been exposed to, where we find that about 5 out of every 1,000 perpetrators will walk free. And so we're spending millions and millions of dollars extending the statute of limitations for maybe 2%, maybe a little bit higher because of repeated perpetration, but about 2% of survivors we're spending all this money for, when we could be increasing access to various social services. Or for example, 39 states, it's legal for someone to claim an LGBTQ plus panic defense, where they state that someone's sexual orientation or their gender identity or expression is in some way responsible for defendant's violent reaction, including murder. 39 states where someone can make this case in response to a sexual assault, to a murder. And Oregon is one of them, where there hasn't been a ban on this defense. So if we think about that, and the millions of LGBTQ plus people that would benefit from having the legal protection of not having defendants allowed to assert this defense, it might go much further than extending the statute of limitations in a justice system that a tiny, tiny percentage of survivors even access, or an even smaller percentage of survivors achieve results through. So I also want to talk a little bit about how this plays out in our workplaces. So we only need to look towards our employee handbooks to see the evidence of this, and the evidence of how sometimes our workplace policies may not be consistent with the values that this movement was founded upon. Many places require staff to travel without providing any sort of funding up front, or even allowing for that. Might be paying someone $13, $15 an hour, expecting them to hold a car payment, car insurance, and to go out on their own dime and drive around for the organization. So that's one way that economic inequity is encouraged by this field in many workplaces. Another way is if places require staff to get doctor's notes for their absences, when we know that particularly marginalized communities often have really bad experiences, or less positive experiences at the very least, with medical doctors. And so you're requiring people of color, Black, Indigenous, queer people, trans people who might have really, really bad experiences with the medical establishment, to choose between their health and taking some time off, and encountering what could be a very traumatic experience. In addition to that, that costs money too, oftentimes. Another thing is your bereavement policy. Would it be accessible for someone who's an immigrant to the United States, who has to bury their sibling or their mother or their father or their grandmother, to fly back to their country and do that under your bereavement policy? Or is it oriented towards someone who's in the community or who lives in the United States? So we need to think about how us often borrowing policies and practices in employment from corporations or other social service sectors can lead to these inequities, which further leads to another inequity, which you see in the middle here. I encourage everyone to access the Race to Lead study, where they focused on nonprofits, and they found that people of color had very, very different experiences than white people in nonprofits. And this is something that's kind of been found across the board. So I encourage people to look into this and also see the connections between the institutional influence and the inequities that we have in our workplace. Now, if you look online, this is a BuzzFeed article right here, you'll find that a lot of people are speaking out against the violence and discrimination that they've experienced in the reproductive justice field, in the gender-based violence field, and a lot of related fields, including ACLU chapters and things like that. I think as our society grapples more with inequity, we're seeing more and more people being empowered to speak up about this. And so that's a direct result, again, to the way that our field has been institutionalized. So I want to briefly talk about some of the impacts of this. Beth E. Ritchie has a talk and an article that they gave that I've linked to at the resources at the end of this, and I highly encourage people to read that as well. Beth states that women of color came to this work because the movement's justice rhetoric promised us that our leadership would be recognized and supported. We believed that promise. We really did believe it, and we dug in because we thought that the work would embrace our lives and our contributions. What we found then is what we still find now: a pernicious form of racism in the movement to end gender violence. This talk was done in 2015. And I know for me, I've seen this. I've seen lots of women of color leave this movement because they were not respected. I've seen lots of women of color who are now consultants, or they kind of work from outside the movement because they don't feel comfortable working for many of the organizations that are represented here today. So I encourage people to, again, see the connections that these things have. Beth E. Ritchie goes on to say, this reality does not make sense because it is inconsistent with what the movement says we believe in. That is, in practice, the movement to end gender violence does not see the links between gender oppression, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, able-bodiedism, and any other form of oppression that women of color experience, not uniquely, but in very particular ways. So these are the real impacts that we're seeing on particularly women of color who come into this work and the experiences that they're having. In addition to this, we also see that people are being left out, and we don't need to look any further than our Oregon Coalition here and their website. I encourage people to click this link here where Troya Atkinson-Stevens highlights an article that talks about the way that sex workers were left out of the Me Too movement. And so we see that, again, as the field became more institutionalized, what we considered violence narrowed. And this is another quote from Beth E. Ritchie, where they state that, this explains why we're not vocal opponents of the massive deportation policies of this administration, which at the time was the Obama administration. It explains why we've made no moves to think about solidarity with the people of Palestine. Why aren't we boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning when sexual violence and state violence is happening in that situation on a very high level? It explains why white women still are credited with discovering notions that women of color had been strategizing around for years. And it explains why we buy into a particular analysis of human trafficking that results in the arrest of trans and queer young people who are involved in the sex industry. So we see that this narrowing of the definitions of violence by institutions, which often focuses on very direct acts of violence, doesn't focus on a culture of violence, may not focus on inequities and the way that that contributes to violence, but just individualized acts of violence, how that leaves people out. So again, with all these things, I encourage people to really look into these resources and see this presentation as kind of a syllabus to further understanding how this plays out. So, excuse me, I want to move into talking a little bit about what we can do about this. And the first step of that is talking about what we shouldn't do. So what doesn't work in responding to this phenomenon? First of all, our first response should not be just writing a statement. That doesn't absolve anyone from harm that they've done. And often that these statements can be very harmful in that they provide cover for people or organizations that have committed racism or where racism is institutionalized. It also can provide a false sense of safety to Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations who are looking at these statements and saying, oh, this organization says that they're anti-racist, maybe I'll look into that. If you haven't done any internal work and you're putting out that statement, that can be incredibly, incredibly harmful. And I have down here that Americans are seeing pressure rather than genuine concern as a big factor in these statements. And so it might not be that effective in itself. And I think a lot of people can see through these statements and can see when they are genuine, because oftentimes that talks about action. Here's what we have done. Here's what we are doing. So someone's first response wasn't, okay, let me write something that says that I'm not doing this. It says, this is what we're doing to encounter these things that we have done. And that reckoning with racism within an organization is an incredibly important aspect that we have to do before we write any statements. Another thing is diversity trainings. We have to be incredibly, incredibly thoughtful about this. And when we do equity in our organization, we have to do it in a very sustained way with people who have a track record and may not be selected by the people who are doing harm. So I've seen situations where the director is accused of racism, and then the director goes and brings in a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant that they have a relationship with or who they like to do this work. And that doesn't exactly work. But I think it's really important to think critically about what does it mean for us to bring everyone to the table and say, hey, no matter where we're at in our understanding on this, we're going to sit down, no matter what your experiences are, whether you're a person of color or not, we're going to sit down and we're all going to talk about race together. And we're going to struggle along, again, no matter where someone's at. Someone might be defensive. They might lash out at these lived experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color, but we're just going to struggle through this. That's often the approach that I've seen when it comes to these kind of trainings and gatherings. And it can be incredibly, incredibly harmful for Black, Indigenous, people of color. And it can also have the opposite effect of what you might be looking for, and that those people will feel less comfortable in this organization. And going off of that, I have this kind of last box in the corner where I think it's important to think about, would we hire someone who asks a domestic violence survivor why they don't leave? Would we hire someone who blames a sexual assault on someone's clothing? I don't think so. We generally would see that as that person's going to do a lot of harm to our clients. However, there's a lot of leeway given when it comes to people's understanding of racism and other forms of violence, of ableism, of homophobia, where I think I've heard a lot of people say things like, well, as long as they're open to learning. And we have to ask ourselves, what does that learning look like? And at whose expense is that learning happening? Because what ends up happening is that person comes to the organization, they do harm to people of color in that organization, and maybe they do learn, but that harm still happened. And so we have to think really critically about what are our requirements when we're hiring staff around understandings of equity, racism, and other forms of violence. In order to not do harm to existing staff, to future staff, and very importantly to clients, we need to really increase that foundation, increase that minimum as far as people's understanding of these issues. Because I've seen a lot of time in organizations go towards trying not to be racist when they could have just hired folks. And the folks are out there who have this understanding. And oftentimes what that looks like is looking at your hiring process, looking at your hiring requirements, and seeing whether or not that's accessible to people as well. So I'm going to briefly go through some of the solutions and reimaginations that are cited in some of the articles that I've cited today. But again, I'm going to do this pretty briefly because I think for each one of these, we could do a whole nother webinar. So I really, really depends on people to dig into this information and explore it for themselves, or maybe with coworkers or friends. In The Braid That Binds Us, one of their recommendations to resisting misinstitutionalization is to build coalitions across issues, social movements, and communities to contribute to broad-based social change. One piece that I added here is while crediting, they added returning and expanding to a structural analysis of DV, and I would add other forms of violence. And what we really need to do here is credit and empower the folks that introduce this analysis. So don't write your own paper and call it its own thing. We really need to highlight the voices that have brought these issues to the forefront in the beginning. We need to build meaningful and reciprocal collaborations between organizations. We can't be influenced by the scarcity mentality that often is pushed by governments and by funders that requires us to compete with each other. We work more efficiently together, and so that needs to be a big part of our work. And again, this comes from The Braid That Binds Us. Another piece is centering the most marginalized communities within our work. So this is another thing where I want to make it really clear that we can do a full day training on what this actually looks like. But I really like the fact that they use the term trickle up social justice, because many people look at, again, that fraternity example and they think, oh, we'll just do some trickle down, we'll talk to the leaders here and they'll just influence everything. But the fact of the matter is that oftentimes those leaders may have utilized a system of hierarchy that's built on racism and sexism to become leaders. And so you're asking them to do a lot when you're asking them to deconstruct that mechanism that got them there. And so we really need to center the most marginalized, like I said, on that college campus. Go to the Gender Equity Center, go to the Multicultural Center, prop up those voices to the point where they have influence, and maybe that will address these issues better than going to the ones that are committing the violence. We need to empower people to assert their own needs and definitions of safety. That's really, really important. We can't put what's safe for someone on them. They have to figure that out and let us know, and then we can serve them. We need to promote and fund community-based research, including participatory and culturally relevant approaches. So not just going into a community and saying, hey, let's extract some information and figure these people out, but going to that community and saying, hey, this is what I'm interested in doing. This is what I'm interested in preventing. Are you interested in that? How can we do that together? And then finally, they state that creating spaces to amplify fresh voices and new thinking about research and practice, particularly work happening by and for marginalized communities. So we can't just lean on the people. In many ways, it goes both ways, because we need to go back in time and really highlight the people that are at the forefront of this work and who've been having these conversations. And we also cannot just rely on who we consider an expert. We have to highlight these new voices, these fresh voices, and be open to new perspectives and alternatives in how we do our work. So one piece, I wrote this in the beginning, or this top part, which is that if we don't honor the work that's been done in this movement, it will be co-opted, and people don't get enough credit for it. So that's one step, is really honoring the work that has been done. And this, this further paragraph is from Paul Kibble's article, Social Service or Social Change. And I highly recommend reading that one as well. And in it, he talks about the fact that we're only able to work within these nonprofits, these schools, and other social service organizations because so many people organized as part of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the queer liberation movement, the disability rights movement. And we need to stay connected to that in order for our work to be effective. We cannot become disconnected from the everyday political struggles in our communities, as Paul Kibble states here. This slide's really helpful for me. This is also from Paul Kibble's social service or social change article, where he talks about who are we accountable to, and talks about how that accountability becomes a source of connection that breaks down isolation and increases our effectiveness. This is not just funders. Funders should not be, in fact, funders should be accountable to us as a movement. And we should be accountable to the communities that we serve, the survivors that we see every day. And so thinking through these questions, I think, can be really, really helpful. And then finally, this is from Beth E. Ritchie's article, where she talks about crunkiness, and she leans on this term from the Crunk Feminist Collective. And she says, for me, crunk is a way of suggesting that being an activist has to do with doing things in some rhythm. Here's what insight taught me. We have to resist the pull towards legitimacy, and we have to resist racist assumptions about women of color needing voice. We do not need voice. We need people to listen to our voices. We are deliberately silenced, but we can speak. We do speak. We will speak. We have to do the hardest work first, not when we are done with the rest of the work. We have to do the hardest work first. To me, it is a chance to take leadership from edginess, from energetic people who live in ways that are generative of enthusiasm for struggle. It would position different people in leadership at all levels, and different forms and kinds of leadership as we reimagine not only our movement, but our movement's relationship to the world. We need to get crunky. So I encourage people to explore the Crunk Feminist Collective in addition to all of these voices and resources that have been highlighted here, and think about this. Because again, my goal here is to just present a foundation that people can explore further, because we're talking about a way of being. We're not talking about, oh, just go to this training and you'll figure it out. We're talking about a constant analysis that questions the role of institutions in our movement, and that navigates that in a complex way where, again, these institutions aren't all bad, and we can't say that we're not going to work with them at all, but we have to be very careful and thoughtful about it. So that's all that I have today. I'm sure that there are questions or thoughts. I haven't looked at the chat at all at this point. This is how folks can contact me, and some of the things that I do in terms of speaking, facilitating, and training. Megan, do you have any questions or any thoughts that have popped up in the chat that I maybe should address?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Trisha and I have been tracking the chat box, and just want to remind folks, if you have questions that you'd like to put forward to Darren to have him chat a little more about, to go ahead and put those in the chat box. And we're gonna pop around and pick a couple of questions as time allows for Darren to answer. So Darren, one question that we had come in is, how can organizations push back together against the ways funders are forcing us to work in white supremacist and capitalist ways? For example, push for a living wage. Funders often don't allow us to ask for enough funds to pay people well. Push back against the types of quote unquote results funders expect, etc. It often feels like organizations have to choose between funding / compliance and doing it our way, but losing the funding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think this is a place where, one, I'll say I don't have all the answers here, and it's going to take strategizing and getting in community with folks, but we are stronger together than we are separately. So if we have one organization that's going to the funders and saying, hey, I'm not going to do this, you're not paying us enough, then I think it's really easy for them from a position of power to say, okay, we're not going to receive the funds. But if we have solidarity, then I think that certainly helps. And I think one example that I can point to from just yesterday is where the Milwaukee Bucks came together and they said, oh, we're not going to play today. there's too much violence happening to Black folks, to Black men that's being televised. We can't focus right now. So we're going to come together and we're going to make this decision against the people that employ us, against the people that own these teams, because we're the work, we're the team. We play. If we don't play, nothing happens. And so I think that's something to think about. But again, we have to think carefully and strategically about that, and hopefully do that in community with others.
Kind of along the point, oh, sorry, Megan. I just saw another question pop up that's related.
Oh, go ahead, Trisha.
Oh, and can I saw that Holly Hart asked about how trans and queer individuals are left out. And so I would say that's because of the way that we define some of those crimes. And so oftentimes the way that we define prostitution or sex trafficking might not include the way that that's happening, and also the way that we criminalize it might target those communities. So oftentimes we see that marginalized communities are engaged in sex work, and it can be empowering for them, and it can be their only way of survival. And those people are then put into jail. Whereas someone who might fulfill the role of the traditional prostitute or trafficking situation, and I apologize if my language is not great there, they might receive protection from the police instead of criminalization. So again, it's the way that we define these crimes, and I really encourage you to check out Troya Atkinson Stevens' article on that to find more information.
Thanks, Darren. Trisha was going to read a follow-up question, but she just messaged me that she had to mute herself. There was a follow-up from that last question that you were responding to around resisting the way that funders are forcing the work to be in line with white supremacist and capitalist ways. And there was a follow-up asking if organizations could form some kind of union and make demands of their funders.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing that I did not talk about here that I think that people should really explore is unionization in this field, and whether or not there are connections between the roots of this movement and the labor movement, and whether or not some of those goals are combined, and if we should maybe get in community with some of the people that are on the forefront of the labor movement and that are at the forefront of unions. But at the very least, if it's not in that more institutionalized way in terms of joining a union or creating a union, then I think just getting together, just connecting once a month with various organizations, we get lots of funding to create SART teams and connect with that community. We also need to connect with the community of practitioners that are preventing and addressing violence as well.
Thanks. There was another question that had come in, and it says, how do we navigate hearing the voices of BIPOC/LGBTQ folks, either as facilitators of educational trainings, panels, etc., without tokenizing those individuals? Example, experienced in org, always going to that one LGBTQ person to provide an LGBTQ training, etc.
That's a great question. And it's a really difficult thing to navigate. I think the first step is to pay them well. I think oftentimes people from marginalized communities that do this kind of training or this kind of work on behalf of their communities are often not paid well. And it's often not understood the way that they're experiencing trauma just to do that work, just to help your organization out. So we need to pay folks for that. And we need to pay them more than we would pay that the local college professor that just has a standard presentation that they give, because for this person, it's likely going to be personal work. So that's the first thing, is really incentivizing them to want to do it through that payment. Another thing is to go to them for leadership. So I've seen situations where people hire an organizer or a facilitator, and then they tell that facilitator what to do. So instead of doing that, go to that person, talk to them about what your goals are, why you're approaching them, and ask them what their suggestions are, what their thoughts are. If you just hire someone to facilitate a single meeting to address institutionalized racism in your organization, then you're not giving them much to go off of, and it's going to be really hard for them to do that work. So I think really investing in that work. I think that people won't feel tokenized when there's a genuine commitment to create change and to bring people like them into the organization. When it is a situation where the organization might be just trying to cover for something, or they're just trying to check a box or tell their funder that they did this, I think that's often when that person feels tokenized. So I think the first thing is just paying them well, and also just doing it in collaboration with, and in the spirit of really addressing the issue, and not because you have to do it.
Thanks, Darren. There's another question here that asks, when advocates are located within an oppressive system like child welfare and hearing problematic statements on the daily, how can programs support staff and interrupt these moments without impacting the survivors we support and the advocacy staff?
I mean, that's a really tough one, because that really represents a huge part of the institutionalization of our field, but also a really important achievements as we've gotten advocates into institutions like DHS or like schools. And so I would say to offset that, or attempt to offset that oppressive experience that they're having in that context, by really recognizing that and providing a comfortable and empowering space as far as the agency that you work in and that they return to. I would also say that that's a question for them as well, that they should be included in, is, are you experiencing this? If so, how's it impacting you? What do you want to do about this? If that person wants to have a conversation, if they're hearing things that they think are unacceptable, I know a lot of organizations that would not have that conversation because they're afraid to lose that funding or lose that partner, which is a real risk. But in making that choice, we're really choosing that institution over the movement. We're choosing that institution over that individual and the oppression that they're experiencing or that they're witnessing. So I would definitely recommend collaboration with that person and what should we do about this? But the tough thing about all this is that there are no easy answers. It's something that we have to struggle through, that I think one of the best things that we could do is look into people who have done this work, look into a lot of these resources that I've utilized here on these folks that have been thinking critically about institutionalization in the movement, because they might have some real thoughts on what to do about that, and maybe we can collaborate or get in community to think about that. Right, and I just want to go ahead and put this up here. I think everyone's going to have access to the slides. Again, I really encourage people to go through here, click the resources, and spend at least as much time as you spent in this webinar reading through some of these, and then looking to some of the folks that they acknowledge and reading through some of that material, because there's a lot here and a lot of our questions can be answered by some of these people.
Thanks, Darren. I know Trisha had put the link to download the slides in the chat box a couple of times, and I just popped it back in there. So if you want to download a PDF of the slides with all the resources that Darren mentioned, You can click on that link. And Trisha also just popped in there the article that Choya had shared from that local program in Vancouver, BC. And so you can click on that as well. And it doesn't look like there's any other questions. So I want to thank you, Darren, so much for joining us and sharing all of this incredible information. The Coalition greatly appreciates the work that you lead and the depth of analysis that you challenge all of us to consider in our movement. If you have any questions for Darren, again, his contact information was up. Feel free to reach out to him via email. If you have any questions for the Coalition or you want to connect with the Coalition, you can reach out to Trisha or myself. We'll put our email addresses in the chat box too. I want to thank Chelsea for providing closed captioning for us today, and thank everyone who was able to take time out of their day to attend and engage in conversations with us. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Darren. And we look forward to continuing to connect with you with the Coalition.
Thank you so much, everyone.